now, and then from this point on, we'll be live.
All right. Hello, I'm Dave Anderson, and I serve as chair of the Master's Level Psychology Licensed Clinical Psychotherapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic meeting. Donna
Honer Quayle.
Honer Quayle.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Rebecca Jabara.
I am here.
And if I mispronounce your name, please correct me. Lauren, you're going to have to tell me how to say your last name.
Lucht.
Lucht. Iris Pauley is not here. Josh Tangaway is not here. And Carrie Wood.
Ari Wold.
Oh, Wold.
Yep.
I might have to check my bifocal adjustment here. I note the following Bsrb staff members are also present: David Fye and Leslie Allen.
Here.
Yeah.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, does not require advisory committees to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment can contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. On November 5th, 2021, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who have requested notice of the advisory committee meetings. This notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material will be posted to the board's website on the day of the meeting. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And Dave, as I was reading that note, I did see that Iris Pauley entered the meeting, so she is now on Zoom. And we do have our conference call live that I mentioned. So if there's anyone on the conference call, please go ahead and introduce yourself now. I didn't hear any beeps, but should someone join us, I will let you know.
Thank you. Hi, Iris.
There. Sorry, I'm late.
Meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda. And Dave, I had a question. The agenda I ended up with, did we update that with the in-residence issue?
So that was already scheduled under old business. So that originally was just going to be the language for what in-residence is. But I sent the statutory language for where those phrases appear. And so I think that could all be covered under that old business topic on the in residence item.
So my agenda didn't have old business on it. Maybe it was before you and I talked. I think I may have made a copy of the old one.
Okay.
All right. So first thing we need is approval of the agenda and a request to see if there are any additions to the agenda.
I would move to approve the agenda.
Okay. Do I have a second?
I second it.
Who seconded? Okay, thank you, Iris. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Yeah, it's good. You can raise your hand. That's fine. Anybody against? Any nays? All right. Next, we have, has everybody had an opportunity to review the minutes from our last meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Any additions, changes to those?
Nope.
And noted.
Okay. Then I would take a motion for the approval of the minutes from our,
So
the minutes
moved.
say November 4th, but the agenda says November 5th.
Right, so the minutes are from November 4th. The agenda has an error, so we'll just correct that on the agenda. It was from the meeting on November 4th.
Very good.
And so moved.
Okay, Carrie's moved. A second.
I second.
Lauren seconds. All right, all in favor say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
All right. I'm assuming there are no opposed. Motion passes. Which takes us to the executive director's report.
Thank you, Dave. I put together a list of items to update the members of the advisory committee on some recent agency updates, board updates, legislative updates, and a couple of other items. So as of January 4th, 2022, most state employees were directed by the governor's office to return to working full-time in state offices. Prior to that, the governor had directed most state employees working in state buildings to work remotely the majority of the time if they were able to do so. But as of January 4th, we were directed to have our employees return to the office. So almost all the employees are working every day in the office. We did put forward a telework pilot for approval by the Department of Administration, which they approved back in the fall. It was temporarily paused during the time that we were all instructed to do more remote work. But now that we are back to mostly in-office work, we have reinstituted that pilot, and we are using that for a couple days each week for each of our investigators. Due to the nature of their work, it makes sense for them to have a little bit more privacy in terms of those conversations and communications they have. So we are collecting information on how the pilot's working, and we'll bring that back and reevaluate it with the possible extension of that to other employees as time goes on. Additionally, last week, we had the office closed for a day on Wednesday due to winter weather and freezing temperatures. The governor had directed state offices to be closed, but there was also a direction that staff members should work remotely if they were able to do so. And because of the technology that we had obtained over the last couple of years, most of the staff were able to work from home. So I just wanted to highlight their work for you. I really appreciate their efforts. I felt guilty that I couldn't give them a traditional snow day. And so that most of them were working, even though a lot of the offices were closed. But I think I want to just compliment their work and let you know how hard they're working to do the work of the office. And then the last item in terms of overall agency updates, we had an open administrative assistant position recently, and we had to advertise for that position a couple times, but we hired a wonderful candidate. Her name is Tyla Wadsworth, and she came on board about a month ago and has been doing a lot of work here in the office. We're really happy to be working with her, and she's going to be a great asset for the office. In terms of some board updates, the first is that in the fall, usually the board has an annual planning day. And at that planning meeting, the legislative items to be introduced in bills are established. Any work that the committees have been working on over the course of that year is in large part taken to the board at those the planning meetings. And because of the pandemic, the board was not able to have that as an all-day in-person meeting. So the board went ahead and had that meeting over Zoom, and due to the nature of Zoom, they spread that over 2 half days. The first half day was at the end of September. The second one was at the end of October. There were a number of changes that the board recommended at these meetings, and some of those items were confirmed by the board at this past January meeting. A couple of the items to highlight for you from that January board meeting is that previously there was a document called the board governance policy. It was not an item that was in statute or regulation, but the board had adopted it a long time ago in terms of some policies and direction for board members and some other items. However, that document over time had become a little outdated. There were some new policies that the board was following, and so it was time to bring that document more consistent with what the current practices of the board are, and just to clean up some of the provisions in that document. And so the board spent a fair amount of time looking through that with legal counsel and myself. And ultimately that was split into two different documents. One is called an expectation of board members document, and the other is called the advisory committee policy. And a lot of those items were in the original document, but their language is very different now. So those two new documents were approved by the board and are now posted on the policy section of the board's website. Additionally, as we have had more members of the public receiving information about meetings and the work that the board and the advisory committee does, we've received more questions from individuals and more individuals who have been viewing our meetings and some that have wanted to attend our meetings. And so there was a need to create a document of guidance for public attendees of meetings. And so we put together a document and brought it to the board for review. And it includes information as far as the responsibility of the board or the advisory committees in terms of whether public comment is allowed at meetings, and that it's discretionary based on a number of factors, but that the chair will approve if there's public comment based on number of items on the schedule and work to be done by those committees. It talks about some general etiquette for Zoom meetings or in-person meetings. It clarifies the process that will be followed when individuals do attend meetings. And then it also talks about receipt of information that wouldn't be appropriate for public comment and that which would be appropriate for public comment. And it clarifies too that there may be some information that it would be much more helpful for the agency and the board to receive outside of a meeting, something like a complaint against a practitioner. And it notes that we do have established policies for handling those, but it's important for us to deal with those complaints consistently so that we are fair to both the licensee and the person who is filing the complaint. And so those are all posted on the board's website. Additionally, there is an item that we asked the board for clarification at the board meeting. There was a bill that passed last year, House Bill 2066, and there was also some statutory provisions for the Bsrb regarding provisional licenses. And we asked the board for clarification on how we should use those two things when we are evaluating candidates who apply for licensure. House Bill 2066 involved applicants for who were military members, military spouses, and some other individuals. And it mainly refers to reciprocity cases. However, it also provides a track for individuals to apply through reciprocity in which the time frame of practice in other jurisdictions is shortened to 1 year if they meet other qualifications. And the provisional license requirement is generally what we can use in certain cases where someone is within about a year from meeting the qualifications. So there was a question of, should these two things work in combination? Should they be separate? And the board and legal counsel was able to discuss that. We did get clarification that these are two separate tracks for licensure, that if individuals want to apply under the provisions of 2066, they may, or if they want to be in consideration for provisional license, they can do that, but that these are separate and should not be used in combination. In terms of during the fall, we had received comments and questions about whether or not we could sync the expiration date for professional licenses under the Bsrb if there were candidates who held more than one license under the Bsrb. Generally, the statute outlines the term of licensure, and for most of the professions, it's 2 years from when you are approved for the license. And so because of that, we generally, we do not have the statutory authority to go ahead and shorten or lengthen a period of licensure to line those up. But each of the advisory committees was asked to discuss if they thought this would be helpful for licensees, if licensees would want this. There was discussion that it may be helpful to remember when those are coming due so that advisory or licensees do not lose track of that. And then there are also some issues with making sure if you are able to use CEs for both types of licenses, that may be helpful to have them come up due at the same time. For other members, they may not want that because they may not want the fees to come up at the same time, or they may want them to be staggered so that they have different requirements for both. They wouldn't have to deal with those all at the same time. So the end result, the consensus of the board was to pursue a change to make this an option, but not to make it a requirement. So individuals would have the ability to do that, but it wouldn't be required for all individuals who hold more than one license. So this year, we'll be looking at some statutory language suggestions for the board to bring back. And then, as I mentioned, that was something that would have to be changed in statute. So it would have to go into a bill before the legislature. So that is something we'd be preparing for the board to look at this year in preparations for a bill to be submitted next year. And then the last item under those general board updates from the annual planning meeting is there was also the conversation of how to deal with records of deceased practitioners if they were a solo practitioner and there was no logical custodian for their records, or in cases where the records of a practitioner might have been abandoned. And so the advisory committees weighed in on different options for this, and there was a general consensus in terms of moving forward to address this issue. However, in working with the Attorney General's office, their Consumer Protection Division will seize records in certain cases, but not in as many cases as we originally had thought. And so we are still working with that office to kind of come up with a plan and come up with maybe a statutory framework to handle those situations. Additionally, in working through the mechanics of what to tell licensees about a new requirement, there were some very good questions about how custodians of records would be established and some other questions that we expect to receive from licensees if this does go into place. So we're still working through that, but we plan to bring that back to the board for more review when we have a proposed solution in place. In terms of some legislative updates for your attention, the legislative session began on January 10th, 2022. The legislation was requested on behalf of the board of the Bsrb. That is Senate Bill 387. And Senate Bill 387 includes 3 recommendations by the board. The first is an item concerning the social work profession. Last year, the Bsrb had recommended a bill, House Bill 2208, which included recommendations by the board. It included a number of different changes, but as that bill went through the committee process last year, there was an amendment put on the bill, not by the Bsrb, but there was an amendment put on the bill that struck the specific number of direct client contact hours within the statutes as a requirement of a clinical practicum for individuals seeking a clinical level social work license. But the problem was that the amendment went further and struck or additional postgraduate experience as determined by the board. And the issue with that language being struck is that in the past, individuals were able to apply and be evaluated if they had a different type of practicum, not necessarily a clinical practicum, and as long as they met the requirements, they could still be evaluated for licensure. But with that language struck, it is more limiting, and someone would have to have received a clinical practicum under that section. And so we don't believe that was the intent of the maker of the amendment last year, and we included that in the bill, and the board approved that as an item to include in the legislation. The second item involves the addiction counselor profession. So currently in statute, for most professions, if they hold a master's level license or higher, they are able to test for the master's level addiction counselor license. We have had some individuals who have requested the flexibility to test for the lower level license, the licensed addiction counselor license, and the agency does not have that flexibility to grant that request because it's very specific in statute. And so this was brought before the board, and the board agreed to recommend this as a change in statute to allow individuals to not only test for the LMAC, that master's level addiction counselor license, but also for those master's level practitioners and above to be able to test for the lower level addiction counselor license. And then the third item was for the licensed psychology profession. And there was a recommendation to require 3 continuing education hours in the area of diversity, equity, inclusion every 2-year renewal period. And those 3 hours could also double count with the existing requirements of ethics and the 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment, as long as those classes also involved the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The hearing on Senate Bill 387 was this past Wednesday, which I guess was yesterday morning. It's been a very busy session, so it kind of feels like it's been longer than that. But that was yesterday morning in the Senate Health and Welfare Committee at 8:30. I understand that that committee is likely to work the bill, which means they have the opportunity to propose any changes or amendments and then have an option to vote either favorably out of committee or unfavorably out of committee. So I will be looking forward to their action on that. Should it pass out of committee favorably, the next step would that it would be available to be worked on the Senate floor. And then should it be passed on the Senate floor, it would move to the House side, be assigned to a House committee, and then we'd go through a similar process where we would be asking that House committee to have a hearing. And then after the hearing, they would have the opportunity to work it. And if it passed both the Senate and the House, it would go to the governor for review and signature. In terms of another legislative item, every year the agency budget has to be reviewed and approved by both the House and the Senate. This year, the agency's budget went before the House Higher Education Committee, and that committee had lots of questions, and we were able to answer their questions, and then they passed out our budget without any changes, and they passed it out favorably. It went to the House Appropriations Committee, and the chair of that standing committee reported our budget and the committee's recommendations to House Appropriations, and House Appropriations voted it favorably without any changes. So that is through the House side right now. On the Senate side, yesterday morning at 9:30, it was heard before the Senate Transportation and Ethics Committee, and they were able to ask some questions about activity of the board and some other items related to the budget. And yesterday they made recommendations on the budget as well and voted it favorably. So tomorrow morning at 10:30, the Senate Ways and Means Committee will have the opportunity to vote out several budgets, and ours is one of those that is scheduled. I don't anticipate there being any issues or questions, but that is the next step in the process. And should it be passed out of there, it would be essentially completed unless it was reopened for some reason, maybe during the omnibus period later in the session, or if there was something that would affect all state agencies that could be added to it. So the budget is, for most purposes, nearly done in terms of the legislative session. And then in terms of other legislative items, we're always monitoring for bills that are connected with the Bsrb in case the board needs to meet to review those items. There has not been a lot of bills relating to health that have been introduced this session, but we're still keeping an eye on those. And we'll be submitting any of those to the board for review. And if the board would like to have a meeting to recommend any testimony, should those get scheduled for hearings, we can always deal with that quickly as it comes up. In terms of one other update, I just wanted to let you know that recently I was asked to present information at a conference for the Federal Associations of Regulatory Boards. It's a group that's called FARB. And the topic I was asked to present information on was public protection through creative access to information. And that was in Fort Worth, Texas. So I drove down there and was able to speak to about 150 people on that topic. And it was a great opportunity to share the work that the board and the advisory committees are doing. And I talked at length about some of the things that we are doing with the agency as well in terms of how we're putting information on the website, what information we are distributing through email. I talked about the launch of the Bsrb YouTube channel, and it was a really great opportunity to talk about some of those things that we're doing. And I received a number of questions from individuals from other states, and I also had the opportunity to hear about some of the things that they are doing and talk to some other licensing boards from other states too to get an idea of their processes because I am still evaluating our internal processes. And it's really helpful for me to make those connections and talk to people so that I can consider those ideas for the Bsrb and bring back those. And if it's a really substantial change, that could be something that the board would need to review and make as well. So it was an honor to be asked to speak, and it was a really great opportunity. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and I'll stand for any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Dave, that was great. That was quite an impressive overview, and I'd like to take a moment to thank the Bsrb staff for all their hard work during the pandemic. It made doing their jobs even harder when they were unable to be in the office, and kind of a lot of the when people make application for a licensure, some people do that via paper still. I'm one of those people. And so somebody had to go every day and get the mail and then bring it in and then figure out how to get that out to people who needed to review that. And so, hats off for you and your staff and your really, really hard work. One of the themes that as an advisory committee member, you're going to hear a lot is that each of the professions does things kind of differently. And so part of the, what makes the job of the Bsrb staff challenging is the fact that every profession has a different set of regs, and they're not always particularly similar. And so it takes kind of an expertise in each of those areas to go through the applications to make sure that the person has met all of those specific requirements, which is exactly why we're going to talk about a couple of things in this meeting today. But just so you have that as a kind of a background piece of information, it is one of the biggest challenges, and I think I'll speak a little bit for Leslie. She can confirm that it would make their lives a little easier if the professions were more closely using the same kind of language in their regs. Is that accurate, Leslie?
My space bar isn't working, I'm sorry. Yes, that would be nice.
The other thing I wanted to say and follow up to Dave's report is, Bsrb, the board puts together, based on kind of a year's worth of discussion, recommendations about changes to statutes. One of the hardest things that we have to do as a board is when what looks like a very competent and capable person applies for a license, but there's something about their application that doesn't meet the requirements, particularly like during COVID, because that created a lot of issues for people, like doing practicums and having to have face-to-face contacts and things that we wouldn't have thought of previously. But as Dave mentioned, we don't have any flexibility. We can't look at those situations and go, well, that wasn't their fault, and they seem like a great candidate, we should give them a license. If they don't meet those requirements, we really are stuck. And so part of what the board does is try to kind of look at those issues and say, are there things that we might want to make recommendations to change if it makes sense, so that we're not unnecessarily keeping people from being licensed. And again, part of the conversation today it revolves around that as well. But on top of that, even after we went through that process and made some recommendations and sent that forward, then we had legislators just strike certain things that we had recommended and change them without even asking if we thought that that was a good idea. And so if that happens and passes, it's not like we get to say, hey, that's not what we wanted. We don't want to do that. Now we're stuck with a new requirement that we have to follow. And sometimes those changes come without our input and without, I'm sure Dave would have said to some of these guys, like, if you do that, that's going to create a little issue over here you haven't thought about. And so it's, again, it just speaks to the hard work of the Bsrb staff. And a lot of what they do is really unknown to the people who are making application. So, just as a piece for you to kind of keep in the back of your minds, knowing how complicated the work that they do is. And our goal is to really kind of, one, be helpful to them while also doing our due diligence to kind of protect the public and uphold kind of the standards for our particular profession. I was really long-winded, way more than I expected to say on that. All right, so I guess we'll move now to old business and the continued discussion on the in residence as it applies to the educational requirements. Leslie, are you going to lead us through this?
You want me to just go through the regulation itself and speak to the highlighted areas?
Yeah, I think set the kind of what it is, where it applies, and then what kind of issues it's created and why we're talking about it today.
Okay, the, when someone is, no, I have the wrong one in front of me. When someone is in school doing their master's degree, they're required by our regulation to complete specific courses in residence. And in residence, as defined in our regulation, means that the student is present at the physical location of the institution for the purpose of completing coursework during which the student and one or more core faculty members are in physical proximity and face-to-face contact. Now, so they have to do that as part of their master's degree program. And when they apply, if it's not an approved program, we send a questionnaire, and that's when it will determine that they didn't meet that requirement. And the reason that this is becoming such an issue is there are more and more online schools. And even when they have a residency, it's not at the institution with core faculty. It's, where they go meet somewhere else, like a hotel or something like that, and they do a week or a long weekend. And specifically in the regulation, there's the 6 semester credit hours of psychotherapy have to be done in residence, and 6 semester credit hours of testing. And so those 12 hours have to be done in residence by every applicant who applies for the master's level psychology license. I'm looking to see if there's anything else in the.
It looked like the requirement for 2 contiguous semesters of enrollment was also.
That I wanted to talk to you about, because in my to my knowledge, that was a holdover. That's from the old requirements. And it stays in there because it's important, but it does not have the same meaning as in residence. Because we don't require that they spend 2 semesters of enrollment at the school learning. They're doing their courses with core faculty.
I'm not sure I understood that. So how is it different, the use of in residence in that particular?
I think it's the traditional, like a school's definition of in residence. They require the student to be enrolled in 2 consecutive semesters at their school in order to grant a degree.
So you're saying it's not a BSRB requirement?
No, I mean, it is, but it's not the same requirement as in residence defined earlier in the regulation.
Yeah, but in our discussions on that point, we think it could be confusing to include that phrase in residence in that section as well with a different meaning. So that is one thing we were planning to talk to the advisory committee about. And it's probably a good opportunity to go ahead and have discussion, and we'd be encouraging changing that just to clarify it for anyone looking at that regulation to make sure that they're in the same understanding too.
Yeah, I would certainly think that could be very confusing, as I was confused by it.
Yeah, I was confused by it as well.
What would be the
Isn't the
recommendation?
important part that it's 2 semesters? And this other part that is requiring the in residence and the way that we're describing it to be meant from a regulatory perspective. That one makes a lot of sense why there'd be some controversy about whether or not that could and can to how much occur virtually. But I think with the education requirement of the 2 semesters, isn't the essence really that we're asking that the applicant have met the requirements of their program and that program meet our Kansas standards of requiring those 2 semesters? And really where that is not quite as controversial.
And Leslie, you may want to weigh in on that in terms of the historical perspective on it.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that. I didn't know in academia, when the schools are laying out the requirements and the language that they use, because it was in residence long before we had in residence in our regulation for coursework. And would it be a problem to remove the word residence and just say attended and completed by the student at the same college or university?
That would be my recommendation. That still leaves the first whole 2 sentences of the problem yet to figure out, but I think that clarifies what I believe the intent of the regulation is.
Which, when Dave and I were communicating about today's agenda, one of the things he had mentioned is that, legislators want to know that licensing bodies are reviewing regs to make sure that they still kind of are as relevant today as they were when they were written, which, Leslie, do you have any idea when these were originally authored?
I don't
Well,
know
we-
when they were originally authored, but I know that the last time they were changed was 2006.
Okay.
Yeah, and at the very end of the regulation, it does have some comments about when it was adjusted. So you can see some dates from previous changes, at least to some of the statutes that are referenced.
Yeah, I guess
So at
the
least
original one
15
was
years. At least 15 years.
Yeah, it was originally written in 1997.
Okay. And as a reminder, I'm so old that I came into this profession before there was licensure for master's level psychologists. So our licensure hasn't been around for what, maybe 30 years, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Mhm.
So the fact that if that's true and we haven't updated this in half that time probably speaks to the fact that it's, a good idea, not only for this particular piece, but all of the regs that we start a process by which we begin reviewing them, particularly because the educational manner in which people are seeking master's degrees, as Dave indicated, is much different than it was certainly when I went to school. And the number of people who are doing at least part of their classes remotely is, from the people we hire, it seems like is now becoming kind of more common than people who are just going and being on campus full time.
I think that's true. Speaking as someone who was, I think, licensed, my first license, I think, was 2005, 2006-ish. I remember painfully going through the application with my program. I went to Washburn University, and Washburn put a lot of effort into aligning their graduate program to exactly create a candidate who would more easily get through all of the different requirements of the BSRB. And I think that's awesome that there's that synergy, and that's possible when you're talking about something that's happening within the state, and you can create that. Gets very muddy if you're training in another state and then you're moving to Kansas and you're wanting to practice here. So I do think there's a need to sort of get with the times. The old way worked really well before everything was so virtual and transient. But it does make sense to take a look at it, at what makes sense in 2022. Because if it was hard, even from a program that had tailored the whole 3 years to equal an easy trip through the BSRB process, I can't imagine how hard it'd be if you'd gone to even just a local program on the Missouri side.
You know, I think as part of this conversation too, I did want to reference some of the conversations that other advisory committees had on the in-residence topic. You know, one of the documents you have in your packet is the copy of KAR 102-4-3A, the educational requirements, and the highlighted sections show where in-residence is mentioned in the statute. The other document is a copy of all of the in-residence definitions for the other professions. And in previous meetings, some of the advisory committees had looked at whether they want the term in residence to continue to mean what it means in their regulations, or whether they want to change that or possibly adopt the standard used in another profession's definition section of their regulations. So that's just something I wanted to highlight for you too. That's why you have a copy of that. There was a request to kind of see, for comparative purposes, how the in-residence definitions compare to each other. So wanted to highlight that too for your discussion on this topic. And I think as an example too, the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee is one example of a committee that was looking at the addiction counselor definition to consider if they want to go ahead and adopt that for their profession, because what they had previously used as a definition for in residence really did talk about face-to-face in the physical location, whereas Leslie, do you want to go ahead and kind of explain the difference between that and what the addiction counselor definition means on that topic?
So in the master's level psychology, it talks about core faculty and at the institution. And for addiction counselors, because they had a lot of programs that were already online, they had been credentialing based on these programs already when they switched to licensure. And so theirs was that they have to have 2 of the following courses be completed while in residence, and it was methods of individual counseling, group counseling, practicum 1 or practicum 2. And their definition of in residence, the student is present at the physical location at the institution or any other location approved by the board for the purposes of completing coursework, during which time the student and 1 or more core faculty members, adjunct faculty members, or agency internship supervisors are in face-to-face contact. And so theirs is a lot more open, a lot more broad. And that was kind of what the board was looking at, the other professions, because addiction counseling was very different. So everyone's been looking at their definition to see if there's any way or desire to open up their own regulations without going, so far that that they're uncomfortable with that.
And one of the key differences between our profession and most of the others is that testing component. And I was really hoping Josh would be here today. Josh is on faculty at Fort Hayes, and I was curious to know kind of what he would think about that, because I don't know if that has gotten to the point where they feel comfortable that you could train somebody in how to do a Wechsler or, one of the other IQ tests online. I mean, the whole point of doing that in residence was that it took place in an environment where you could train people. And then I'm sure most of you, like me, got to do that behind a two-way mirror while somebody was watching you and checking off every little thing that you did or didn't do according to how that process was supposed to occur. The social workers and counselors and marriage and family therapists may not have those kind of requirements, so some of their courses may be easier to do in an online kind of environment. And this becomes a real issue, and I'll give you an example. Maybe I shared this before, that we had a person apply for licensure from out of state who'd been to a online university, and they were getting together at hotels for a week or two to do classes. And one of them was a testing class, and because it wasn't in residence, it didn't meet the requirements. So we had a hearing about that, and I asked the woman, so how did that work when you were doing kids? Because I was curious, did they have somebody gather up children to bring to this hotel and have them do testing? And she said, no, they just pretended like they were kids. And so, okay, that's different. And for me, then I would say well, that's not exactly, there is a line there that we do have to draw about what's appropriate and what may not be appropriate. And so all of these changes become real things, because then the Bsrb staff has to look at it and go, as Leslie indicated, if we open the door really wide, would somebody like that have gotten through and been licensed and been able to practice providing testing to children, even though they've never done that? So interested in your input on that topic. And in terms of these two, and I think we're referring to 1A and 1B now.
C1A and 1B.
I think my concern, so a few things. I also went to Washburn. I graduated in 2016, and as Lauren mentioned earlier, they do map it on really nicely into the Bsrb's expectations. When I think of, and I work with children primarily, but I also work with children and the fact that they're younger than me, but they are grown adults now. They're just younger. They're older than they were when we started, but they're definitely younger now than I am. That in residence piece, or at least practicing and showing mastery in front of other professionals, I think it's really important, because there are things that I feel like faculty could miss inadvertently by just doing online, as far as that warmth piece. Even, some of the techniques for sharing stance, you could list them, but it's I think if there was a way that, let's say if they came from a program that was online, but there was a way to test and essentially assess for mastery of the skill with, again, you can pretend to be a child today, but until you are a 2-year-old standing on the table and spinning, you are not a child. And I have seen that. It's one of those things that if there was a way that we could perhaps assess for mastery in working through that, I don't know what that would look like. But it would keep us from having that door so wide open that we perhaps miss somebody and not put someone in place that is quite ready or has the skill set to actually do it effectively and engage in practice that's efficacious. So those are just my thoughts with that piece.
I think both of you are spot on. I concur. I don't think I would have been competent to test right out of graduate school if we had not had so much in-person practice with real children, real patients, doing all of the interesting things that happen during those tests. And there's so much important information gathering in the 15 to 30 minutes before and 15 to 30 minutes after the test, once the video camera gets turned off. That is such an important lesson to have that information, to continue to use that time as information gathering, that at that elbow support you'd get from a professor who has an earbud in your ear. And so I think what I'm hearing is we can't really know what the quality standards of the faculty on these hotel weekend adventures. I mean, they could be great at doing all of these things, or they could be doing none of these things and it could be a free for all. And it's probably somewhere in between. And we all know it will not all be equal. And so there's the problem, right? Is there's not a standard that the online universities are going to all adopt that dictates what testing requirements will be. So then it comes back to the state to regulate it. And I would agree, if there was a way to test for mastery, that would give us a loophole. I mean, if you compare it to, for example, becoming licensed by the state of Kansas to be a physician, there's multiple tests, but then there's also multiple opportunities where your mastery is assessed. And so with ours, we're doing the EPPP and we're really vetting your program, right? That's our threshold for our profession. There's not currently that mastery check. And I don't know that the EPPP assesses procedural skills during test administration in a way where that data would be helpful for us either.
Well, and Lauren, one thing when you say that, because the EPP popped up into my brain too, as far as the standard that we use. Some states, when they have the verbal component of the EPPP, perhaps if it's clinical, and again, I know this would take a lot of preparation, but if we know that, hey, this set of universities in the state of Kansas is, very good and they practice, XYZ, maybe there's almost a behavioral component instead of like a verbal, right? Where they're verbally giving a response, where they are observed giving that, because, you will never be able to list and work through every behavior a child might engage in. But if you could get a subset of families that are like, hey, I would be fine with my kid doing this. You have kids that are on the spectrum, or kids that are maybe just very busy little kids and 2-year-olds versus a 7 and 8-year-old. If they could pass, 80% of, how do you keep it standardized when you have a child that is crawling on the floor? How do you do these things? That might be a way for us to promote and encourage budding clinicians, even if they're online, to come into the field. But we're also doing our jobs as the other adults and practicing clinicians and protecting the community.
I feel like I agree with that. And I feel like, so I was going over our definition, the master's level psychology definition of in residence. And I feel like something that maybe we could add, because I think we all agree that the face-to-face is super important, and you can't, I think Lauren said that you don't know what these weekends at hotels or whatever, what that really looks like. So I went to Emporia State, and I agree that they kind of aligned the standards with the state requirements, and it was really helpful at that time for that. But part of it with the in residence present at the physical location of the institution for the purpose of that. So for me, I feel like at Emporia State University, so when I was a grad student, I didn't know any kids. I didn't have any kids. I didn't have nieces and nephews, but I had to test kids. So I went to a church and said, hey, may I test your kid? I'm a grad student. Can I? And so I was recruiting people on my own. It would have been really helpful at that time if I would have been allowed to go to the elementary school or the middle school there and work with, the psychologist in that building testing at that time for that purpose of testing. So I don't know if there's a way to include things like that for for the master's level psychology, where it would be pre-approved by the board to work with, even if it's another licensed professional, a school psychologist, a licensed professional that knows that. I don't know how that would work, if that's even possible, but instead of, for me just pulling a kid that I didn't know and recording them and then giving the recording to my professor to review and to tell me you did this right. Because I agree with what Kari said about there's so many variables with testing and with things like that, or with therapy, with autistic kids or with ID kids or whatever. I remember having a school course and it was like schools in crisis. And I remember my professor saying, well, let's pretend. And he pretended to be a student who I had to figure out what the crisis was. And I remember that because now working with children in schools, it is so different than actually working with a child. So I get that we need to move forward and look at ways with online programs, but this in-person and hands-on experience has got to be a priority for me anyway. But it would be nice to kind of expand a little bit, I think, with the master's level in residence definition. I feel like on campus or at the university is very limited, but if the universities could work with other agencies like the schools in Emporia or something like that, I think it would be beneficial and helpful. I'm not sure how I feel about the full online programs. I think they're missing a lot of practical knowledge. But
one thing that popped into my head as you were saying that was that we could add, we have the practicum supervisor complete an attestation. We could ask the professors who oversee the 2 testing courses to provide an attestation, and one of the attestations should come from the direct clinical supervisor of the in-person experience, and then maybe that could be from the 2 weeks at the hotel where they meet up to do all of the practicing. And maybe that is a partnership with a school district, because it is possible to do it right. Our hesitancy is that we know that there will be entities that could potentially do it wrong. And so we want to protect our community by making sure what we accept is right. But there may be something in the form of an attestation from the professor of the testing courses that's actually the one providing the instruction. I still kind of go back to what David said, though, about, I just remember how important it was to play with the blocks. And we took home our kits and lived with them and played with them, and to do online universities. And these are expensive. I know in grad school, I would not have been able to afford to buy these tests, but I would not have been able to learn if I did not have one with me for 6 months straight. And that's for every single test that I'm trained on. That's probably $5,000 worth of testing materials. And so I think, the quality could be all over the map in terms of what students are getting exposure to, as well as actually the time they're getting with each instrument to practice and play with it.
Leslie, you had said in the counselor's language, it said, or a location approved by the board. Is that a location that's prior approved by the board, or a location that once they submit it, the board would approve?
Could probably be both. If a school is approved by the board, then that could be approved at the same time. But if someone comes from a state that doesn't have an approved school, it could be approved after the fact.
because I like Rebecca's idea that, having, because I remember what that was like trying to recruit kids when I was in grad school. And there are some kids out there who could probably benefit from, some testing and parents getting some information they might not have otherwise. I think the other question I had in regard to this, because what my memory, or what I'm reminded of, is that it's that issue around core faculty that seems to be the other kind of issue that trips people up when they're doing online. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. It's, there's, I think, more adjunct faculty teaching than core faculty, and it becomes an issue when they have to have specific courses in residence, or at all to have courses in residence.
And so that, I really have mixed feelings about that, because I would see a real advantage to adjunct faculty who had expertise in a particular area and who could come in and say, this is what I do in my professional life as a psychologist or as a therapist or somebody who does testing every day, that there could be some real advantages to that. And yet our regs say that these need to be really kind of full-time faculty at the university. And that does create a lot of issues for people who are doing online universities, because they tend not to have a lot of those folks on staff.
Just to second David's opinion on that, I actually do think that is an area we should discuss also, because for the exact reason he mentioned, but given the current nature of employee shortages and people being stretched thin and across all fields, I personally don't see why somebody who is an adjunct, but that is their, what they do in their outside world, outside of teaching, and that is their specialty. I do think that's something we should consider, because, otherwise, if you have a department that's, 2 staff short and they're scrambling, trying to do more than they're doing, like, how quality is what they're doing then if there's too stretched thin? But if they have somebody on staff who is an expert and they perhaps just aren't core faculty, well, we might be promoting better education and better oversight if they're not stretched so thin because they're core.
I think that's a really good point and a really important differentiation, right? I think it's important. Adjunct professors can be amazing. Well, I think what the intent was, oh my goodness, what if an online university isn't vetting faculty? That's why they're all adjunct. Nobody's really invested, and it's a diluted program because there's not a core team. And so that's really about the quality of the university, not at all whether or not they employ or don't employ a X percentage of adjunct faculty. It's really, is their department of psychology good and competitive and worthy of licensure? I don't know that making the guess based on their percentage of core faculty to equate whether or not they're a good online university, that may not be the best measuring stick. So I also support taking the adjunct professor language out. I think if you are employed by the university to teach that class, we assume that university has vetted you, and if a university loses their accreditation, I'm certain that that's then something we would take a look at. Does anyone feel strongly that adjunct faculty should not be allowed?
If you look at that first paragraph, kind of under 102.43a, where it defines core faculty, and it specifically speaks to an individual whose education, training, experience are consistent with their role within the program. It's almost like you could just kind of get rid of the word core. And
Exactly.
that would seem like it still defines what we still want the faculty member, their qualifications to be.
Yeah. But then it doesn't limit, someone from, because they're not tenured, or they're not on track. They clearly were chosen for that position for a reason, and they've passed their licensure or whatever the requirement is to meet the criteria for that position. So I think that would be a great idea.
Have to take out some of the other parts below that. It looks like the individual is primarily professional employment is the institution in which the program.
Yeah, that and that they're part of kind of the program development decision making. There's probably some pieces. Leslie, do each of the professions define core faculty in a similar way, or do they make a distinction between core faculty and adjunct?
It's mostly the same. If there are any differences, they're very minor. But they were all written around the same time. So besides addiction counseling.
Well, we're kind of solving a problem that you didn't even ask us to, right? We just haven't fixed the in residence part, but we're moved on to core faculty. Is everybody comfortable if we have Bsrb staff kind of look at that core faculty, change it from core to faculty, and then kind of update the language for what that means and bring that back to the group?
Yeah.
And just one question. It says means the student is present at the physical location of the institution. Do you want that to stay or be amended?
In terms of the in-residence piece?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure did we arrive at a consensus there?
I don't think so, because I think the area that at least consistently I was hearing is just then that how do we determine then if somebody is competent and has mastered especially the in face-to-face clinical piece is the one thing that I think keeps snagging us on the in-residence.
Is there a way to just do it partial, like that it's partial in residence, so there is time for that evaluation, that some of it can still be, I don't know, done in other ways, but part of it is in residence? That's the only compromise I can kind of think of.
I feel like we're just not ready. I feel like we're not ready to make a change there. Like, we have so many questions and everyone's sees the importance of the in-person. It doesn't feel comfortable yet to make a change on that, is what it feels like.
Well, and my other question was, does any universities even do some of those in-state online? Like, is anybody in-state doing any of that yet? I know. Yeah. So you're right. Like, it's really not there. I know we just ordered a bunch of psych testing here. And I know the psychological testing is moving more and more so that you can do it, but more virtually, but still there's a lot that's very difficult.
Yeah.
It seemed like the closest language I heard was if you had an in-residence requirement where they demonstrated mastery of, so even if their practice in whatever that skill was done off university, if there was a requirement that they came to the university and somebody attested to the fact that they had demonstrated mastery of the skills there, that seems about as close as I can get. I'm not sure I'm 100% comfortable with that yet, but it's. So let's table that part of it. Great discussion. Really, really thought-provoking. Appreciate that. And to honor everyone's time, Dave, shall we move on to new business?
Sure, that'd be fine.
Are we going to have enough time for you to do your board training?
Yeah, I think it should be enough time. I'll move fast through that.
All right.
Okay, great. And I'll skip ahead just for a second, just to let you know, as Dave mentioned earlier, we had a planning meeting for the agenda. And so under new business, item C, discussion on unprofessional conduct regulations, you did receive a copy of the unprofessional conduct regulations within your packet. That's really not something that we had planned to talk about today, but at the conclusion of the meeting, I wanted to let you know that between this meeting and the next meeting, we would ask that you go and read through all those regulations so that you can come back to the next meeting with some thoughts and ideas. One thing is that, yeah, we have been more or less asked by the state to make sure that we are being responsible about our statutes and regulatory language, to make sure that these are being reviewed by the board and the advisory committees so that they aren't outdated. So when you go through these rules of unprofessional conduct, be thinking about, is the terminology still accurate? Does it still mean what it was originally intended to mean, or is it still applicable to how we define things today? Are there items to take out of there that should be removed from the regulations? Are there items that are maybe missing from the regulations? And be thinking about those rules of unprofessional conduct or the unprofessional conduct regulations with certain filters too. Be thinking about things like social media and how that could apply to the unprofessional conduct regulations, or the prevalence of telehealth and how those unprofessional conduct regulations might be interpreted in terms of a telehealth arrangement versus a person-to-person in the same room type situation. So I thought I'd go ahead and touch on that before I start the training, but between now and the next meeting, just plan to read through those, bring back any comments for the next meeting. And that's not just for this advisory committee. I'm asking each of the advisory committees to do that as part of the bigger picture, look at all of the statutes and regulations, but I'm asking each of the groups to look at the unprofessional conduct regulations first. The Bsrb is a public protection agency, so I thought in terms of where to start, we should probably start with those rules of unprofessional conduct. So now we can kind of move to the training. So you do have 4 documents in the packet that was sent out earlier. 3 of those documents are somewhat short, and then there's a much lengthier document. So I'll go ahead and summarize those and talk about your responsibilities. There's going to be information in here that's, we're going to talk about it as it relates to the responsibilities and expectations of board members. And Donna is a relatively new board member, so this will be the first time that Donna's going through the training. But I think it's important for the rest of you who are new advisory committee members to also hear the information about board members first, because I think it's important for you all to understand the role of the Bsrb, the role of staff of the Bsrb, and the role of board members, and then your role as advisory committee members within that bigger process. And then to jump ahead a little bit, there's a document on the advisory committees specifically, and there is language in that I'll touch upon when we get to it, that says that a lot of the rules and policies that affect board members should also apply to advisory committee members. So just keep that in mind as we walk through these documents, and that some of the expectations for board members should also apply to the advisory committee members too. So the first document I'll talk from is that expectation of board members document. This was previously in the board's governance policy, but now it's a new document that is posted on the board's website. It basically first talks about the authority of this document. So as a state agency, we are created by the Kansas legislature, and we are governed by the statutes, which statutes are items that are passed in bills and become law, and then also regulations. And the regulations, you just looked at regulatory language. That is an agency's ability to really flesh out the details within the statutory framework and statutory authority, but it's basically how agencies are allowed to work through and interpret their responsibilities in statute. After that, you have any policies that the agencies might choose to adopt, and this fits into that category. So the first part of the document indicates that the authority of this document is that it falls after any statutes or any kind of federal rules. And so you can go ahead and keep that in mind when you're looking at this document here. Second is the mission statement for the BSRB. The mission of the BSRB, in accordance with the intent of the Kansas legislature, is to protect and serve the consumers of mental health services and the professionals that offer them through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and the creation of appropriate regulations accomplished through efficiency, fairness, and respect to all of those involved. The guiding principles of the agency and the board is that individuals in Kansas should expect that licensed mental health providers are qualified, competent, and professional. And they should expect that individuals regulated by the agency should expect equitable and fair treatment in relation to licensing activities, disciplinary processes, and administrative regulations. The agency will provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost-effective, and cost-efficient, and courteous and competent, be guided by principles of ethical principles, clear policies, and progressive thinking and strategic decision-making, and shall respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. There's some information there about the services provided by the BSRB. We process license applications and license renewals in a timely manner. We take disciplinary action when appropriate, provide timely information to the public, and then maintain rules and regulations and statutes. On page 2, you'll see some general information about the code of conduct. The board has many responsibilities, but 3 specifically they wanted to highlight in this document. First, integrity, and it speaks that individuals who serve on the board should have no criminal or professional misconduct record, nor commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints. Additionally, they should possess sound moral principles, have courage and convictions to withstand pressures to be swayed from the public protection agenda. They should be honest about personal agendas and leave them outside of the boardroom. They should reveal any actual or perceived conflicts of interest and appropriately recuse themselves from decisions or actions in those areas of interest. They should not represent their personal opinion as that of the board itself, and they should be limited to 1 unexcused absence a year. In the area of conflicts of interest, it is asked that the BSRB guide against conflicts of interest, and it notes there that no member should have personal financial benefit as a result of service to the BSRB, except for the sustenance and mileage, and board members do get in statute a small amount per day if they have a meeting that day. Board members who have a conflict of interest according to the stated criteria should refrain from voting on the matter. Board members should disclose any relationship with any other agency or individual involved with the BSRB and be excluded from matters involving such a conflict. It does note that members can serve as part of an organization, but if they do serve in that organization that works in any way that might go against the goals or the main mission of the BSRB, they should inform the board chair about their membership in those groups. They should not accept any gifts or promotional items received as part of their affiliation with the agency for personal use, and should not use the agency's name or agency information for personal gain. And then the last item is confidentiality. And the vast majority of the communications that you will receive from the BSRB and me specifically are not confidential. However, there are a handful of items that are confidential, and you should be aware of that. Any items that might occur in an executive session. So most meetings are open, but occasionally the board can vote or the advisory committees can vote to go into an executive session. If that happens, the items that are discussed in the executive session should stay confidential. Also, any discussions concerning actual or potential litigation should remain confidential. And there's a few more items that I'll talk about a little bit later that are also confidential. The document outlines the main processes for the board. It notes that in statute, the board is composed of 12 board members, and each is appointed by the governor to serve a 4-year term. Members can also be reappointed for 1 additional term, so you can serve at most for 8 years as a board member. It outlines in statute that the board members are 8 professional members for public members. Within the 8 professional members, there's 2 licensed psychologists, 2 social workers, 1 professional counselor, a marriage and family therapist, a master's level psychologist, a licensed addiction counselor or licensed clinical addiction counselor, and 4 members of the board represent the general public. Additionally, in terms of how individuals become members of the board, the governor has sole authority to appoint and remove members of the board. And the statute indicates that there are 3 main reasons the governor could remove a board member, and that is malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance. And those are legal terms, but in a big picture sense, if you have a legal duty and you do an intentional bad action that violates that legal duty, that would be something that would fall into the category of malfeasance. If you have a legal responsibility and you make a pretty egregious mistake that creates you to violate your legal responsibilities, that's more misfeasance. And if you have a legal responsibility to act and you refuse to act or you don't act, that would be something that would be under the concept of nonfeasance, as a general explanation of those legal terms. But the main takeaway here is that the board has some ability to govern itself in terms of these policies it adopts. However, the board does not have control over adding board members or removing board members. That's left up to the sole discretion of the governor. In terms of meetings for the board, meetings occur in terms of full meetings every other month on the 2nd Monday of the month. So the board met in January, so the next meeting will be in March. However, it notes that board meetings can occur otherwise, and those sometimes occur in the spring during the legislative session. Occasionally, bills get introduced and scheduled for hearings with very little time. So I monitor when those bills are introduced and I check the calendar. And if something does get scheduled for a hearing that I believe the board would want to weigh in on and potentially ask me to introduce legislation on the board's behalf, I go ahead and try to set up a time when the board can meet, and then the board gets a chance to meet. And if they have a majority that can meet, they can give me an instruction and provide a decision, and then I'll go ahead and present testimony to the legislature on behalf of the board. There's some general policies as far as what will appear on the agenda during board meetings. There's some information there about the authority of the chair, and on page 4, it continues to authority of the vice chair. There's also a note about emergency executive sessions or emergency executive session should something happen to the chair of the board. Also on page 4, it talks a little bit about the board and executive director relationship. So I'll go into that so you understand a little bit more about the role that I play. So the executive director will communicate any personnel matters that need to be addressed by the board to the chair of the board. And the chair of the board will represent these board-related issues to the board. Personnel matters are generally another area that would be under executive sessions. Also, the executive director will communicate to the staff of the Bsrb board wishes, intentions, and policies. And I have been doing a monthly staff meeting, so that's when I inform my members of my staff about the board's decisions. In terms of delegation to the executive director is the administrative head of the organization, serving at all times under the board. The executive director is responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board. In this case, he shall assist in the developing of the overall program and shall recommend policies and activities for consideration by the board. The executive director shall have sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to the policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. And just to let you know, if we do wish to hire anyone or change the salary, those both have to be approved by the governor's office. They have to approve anyone we wish to bring on board here and any amount that we want to pay them. So there is a check on that process from the executive branch. In terms of executive expectations, the executive director shall keep the board advised of Bsrb activities by issuing a report to the board at each full board meeting, which summarizes pertinent information. And the executive director shall prepare the agenda for the board meetings in consultation with the board chair. On page 5, there's a note that talks about the executive director working with the chair in terms of planning that annual planning meeting. And then under D, monitoring the executive director's performance, it notes that the board shall, when necessary, utilize executive session to discuss issues concerning the executive director. The board shall also formally evaluate the performance of the executive director each calendar year and on an annual basis thereafter, with emphasis on whether set outcomes are attained. And then I wanted to note too, this document talks a lot about the responsibility of the Bsrb and the board in terms of licensing, but the board is also responsible for investigations and discipline of practitioners. That is handled by a subset of the board made up of 5 members of the board called the Complaint Review Committee. There is a process by which that Complaint Review Committee operates, and that is posted on the board's website under policies as well. The 5 members that make up that complaint review committee are made up of 1 licensed psychologist, 1 social worker, 2 public members, and then 1 other member representing the professions overseen by the BSRB. Like I mentioned, that is posted on the website, and the CRC, when they review the reports that our investigators put together, they meet every other month, the same month that the advisory committees meet. The next meeting for that group is on Monday of next week. So the next document that I'll be talking from is a 2-page document called the Advisory Committee Policy. And the Advisory Committee Policy previously was included in the Board Governance Policy, but some things have changed in this. The BSRB advisory committees are a creation of the board for the purpose of supporting the board and carrying out its mission to protect the public. Members serve at the pleasure of the board in actions pertaining to informing, licensing, and disciplining of those persons regulated by the board are the methods for accomplishing the mission. The process is that an advisory committee fulfills its purpose by addressing issues referred to it by the board through the advisory committee chair or the executive director. A committee may suggest items it believes the board should consider by referring those through the chair of the advisory committee. When the latter occurs, the board has 3 options that it could pursue in terms of recommendations from the advisory committee, and those are listed below. In terms of the structure of the committee, it notes that the chair of the advisory committee will be a board member. If the profession is represented on the board, the chair of the advisory committee will be a board member licensed in the discipline of the committee and appointed by the governor to represent the discipline on the board. It notes that any other members appointed to the governor to represent that discipline on the board will serve as a member of that advisory committee, and that a public member of the board will be on each of the advisory committees. In terms of non-board members on the advisory committees, there will be a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 additional members. It talks about the executive director being a non-voting ex officio member of the committee, the assistant director and licensing manager being recommended to attend those meetings, and that legal counsel for the board may attend if it's encouraged that they attend. So we don't usually have legal counsel here present, but if we ask them to attend, then they should attend the meetings as well. In terms of the terms of advisory committee members, each of you will be serving a term of 2 years. You can be appointed for up to 4 terms. So in total, you could also serve on the advisory committees for 8 years. In the past, I understand these terms kind of blended together, but starting this year, when things come up at the end of the fiscal year, which will be in June, those names of individuals whose terms are coming due, they will be submitted to the chair of the board. This policy talks about that the ability to appoint members to the advisory committee or remove members from the advisory committee is up to the chair of the board. So the board will be able to review and reappoint members through that process. It also notes that appointments to the committee should be staggered to make sure that there's not a number of too many members of the advisory committee reaching their maximum length of service at the same time. And then a really important phrase there, the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will apply to the advisory committee members. Under the selection process, some of you have already seen some of this language, but there is a little bit different language in terms of what items should be considered when evaluating candidates for the advisory committee. It does talk about in reviewing nominations, the committee should work to ensure there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity, and that members should provide representation of the levels of licensing for that discipline, and those members should be selected from among public and private practitioners and educators. In terms of the actual mechanics for selecting members, that's found on page 2. And then there's a note at the bottom about some guidance for how members will be notified once they are members of the advisory committee. The next document I'll be speaking from is a 2-page document called Guidelines for Public Attendees. I already kind of mentioned this document earlier, but this is a new document. It's now posted on the website. It's been approved by the board, and it clarifies for the public the mission of the BSRB, of the Public Protection Agency, and that most of the meetings of the board are open under the Kansas Open Meetings Act. It indicates that public comment is not required, but that the agency values the receipt of information to assist the work of the board and the advisory committees. And then it outlines that we wanted to provide some guidance for individuals who attend meetings or wish to talk at these meetings. It notes some in-person guidelines, virtual guidelines, and then some general information about avoiding disruption at meetings. On page 2, it talks about the procedure for public comment, and it notes about the chair's discretion, the chair of the board or chair of the advisory committees in terms of being able to provide public comment. Some of that is also affected by the number of items on the agenda because there needs to be time for the board and the advisory committees to complete all their work. It provides some explanation here about how individuals can go about requesting to provide public comment, and then the responsibility of me as executive director in terms of communicating with them. It says that written comment is not required for public comment, but it notes that it's helpful to let the members of the board or advisory committee be knowledgeable about the topic. It notes that at the conclusion of the comment, the chair may allow time for questions or may move to the next item on the agenda. And then, as I mentioned below, it provides some topic relevant for public comment. It notes the areas that public comment has occurred for the board and the advisory committee in the past. It notes that the agency is a creature of statute and regulation, and some of the public comment in the past has involved requested changes to things like statutes and regulations concerning the professional conduct, fees, licensing, continuing education, or other areas that are in the statutes or regulations. And it also notes that certain information may not be appropriate for the agency to receive in the form of public comment, such as information about a specific practitioner. And then it provides information on how individuals can file that information with the board and a link to the report of alleged violation / complaint form so that we can receive that. And it notes that it's important for us to do it in that way, both to be fair to the people who wish to provide that information to the board and also for the licensees that we regulate to make sure that we are being consistent in our approach to handling those types of investigations. The last document I'll talk from is the larger document. It is titled Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board and Advisory Committee Members Orientation. It is from Janet Arndt, who was previously our Principal Assistant Attorney General assigned from that office to provide legal counsel to the board. And as I mentioned earlier, Jan provided training for the board and advisory committees last year. So I'm not going to mention everything that's in this training. I'm going to highlight and give you some information on some key points within this document. But as time allows, I think it's a really good document, and I would encourage you to read through it. And if you have questions on it, please feel free to let me know. This document basically provides a framework, and it notes that the state of Kansas regulates professions, and each profession is regulated by a licensing board or commission, and that it is created by the Kansas legislature for the purpose of ensuring that licensed professionals are competent and do not pose a risk to the public. So while we might recommend changes sometimes that aid in the assistance of licensees, our number one priority has to remain that we are a public protection agency, and we always have to keep in mind the people who are receiving these services first, and then go from there. Professional licensing board is created by enabling legislation, which establishes the board's form, mission, powers, functions, tools of implementation, and enforcement abilities. Any power that we have has to relate somewhat to our statutory framework passed by the legislature. Within this, we also have to uphold any kind of federal constitutional protections, such as equal protection and due process rights, and those prohibit the board from acting in a manner which results in disparate or inconsistent treatment of persons similarly situated. On page 2, it notes that the Kansas legislature does still retain control over the agency in a few different ways. The legislature may pass legislation which would totally abolish the board. So the legislature could eliminate the Bsrb if they chose to do so. Also, the legislature could pass statutes and regulations which would significantly change the mission or responsibilities or powers of the board. So it does still have that authority as well. And as I mentioned earlier, each year our budget has to go before the legislature, and it has to be approved. We don't receive money directly from the state. We are a fee-funded agency, and we operate based on the licensure fees and other fees that we collect from those that we regulate. And in fact, by statute, we are an agency that has to contribute 10% of all revenue we receive back to the state general fund, which last year was about $78,000. So with whatever is left, that's our operating budget and any money that is in the agency's fee fund. However, the legislature sets in their appropriations bill a limitation on how much we may spend from that fee fund. So while they don't give us money, they do control the amount that we can spend. And should they choose in the appropriation bill to set that number at 0, even though we had money in the fund, we wouldn't be able to spend it, and we would effectively not be able to operate. The document talks a little bit about some of the language that you're going to find in statute and regulation. There is certain language that says shall, and in those cases, the board must do those items. The other item you may find is the word may. And when you see the word may, it really comes down to a discretionary approach, and there's usually a number of factors that need to be figured into those decisions by the board. It also notes that the general purpose, whether explicit or implied, of a licensing board is to secure for the people of Kansas the services of competent, trustworthy practitioners and to protect the public against unprofessional, unauthorized, or unqualified practitioners. The purpose of a licensing board is not to promote or protect the profession as a whole. Those functions typically lie with a private professional association. A licensing board accomplishes its purpose through licensing applicants who meet the established eligibility qualifications, generally education, experience, and an examination, and through the disciplinary process for which a license may be conditioned, limited, revoked, suspended, revoked, and otherwise sanctioned for a violation of the statute or regulation. At the bottom of page 2, there's some information there about functions and duties of licensing boards in general. It notes that there are some different abilities that boards may exercise that somewhat parallel the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government. Under executive authority, we have an enabling act, and we're required to follow certain processes, such as having an open meeting under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, and also having most of our records open to official open records request under the Kansas Open Records Act. And that is to ensure that the public's business is conducted openly. Under a quasi-judicial authority, we enforce the Enabling Act by holding quasi-judicial hearings to make findings of fact and conclusions of law and determining whether those facts prove a violation of the law has occurred. In general, some of those judicial capacity type hearings, the original review of those would be done by the Complaint Review Committee, and some of those meetings don't fall under the Kansas Open Meeting Act. They fall under a different act called the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, and that I'll talk about a little bit more detail later on during this training. In terms of the legislative authority, we have a quasi-legislative authority to adopt regulations in order to implement and interpret the Enabling Act with more detailed and more specific requirements. Those still do go before the legislature, and we're required to follow certain guidelines and responsibilities, such as providing a public hearing, allowing comment, and different things like that. On page 3, under statutes, regulations, and policies, a regulatory board implements and enforces statutes and regulations, and at times operates according to its internal policies. And in order to be effective, board members need to understand the difference between statutes, regulations, and policies. So statutes are laws. They are passed by the Kansas legislature through authority derived from the Kansas Constitution and subsequently signed by the governor. Statutes generally become effective on July 1st of that session year, but they can have a later implementation date if that is specified in the legislation. So Senate Bill 387 is an example of, should that bill be enacted, that would go into law and become part of our statutes. Regulations, on the other hand, are adopted by a board to further implement and carry out the purpose of the particular statutes. A board's authority to adopt regulations is derived from statute. So earlier today, there was a good deal of conversation about the in-residence regulations. So we have a general authority to require that there is appropriate educational standards for the process of establishing licensure. Within that, we have the regulations, and within the regulations, we have terms like in residence, where we go ahead and have some authority to figure out some of those discretionary details. On page 4, you will see that there's some things to consider when you're evaluating a regulation. Is there a need for the regulation? And then determine the statutory authority to adopt the regulation, and then follow the right process and the procedure to adopt the regulation. And that procedure is largely done by the Bsrb once a decision is made by the board. And then if the advisory committee might come to a recommendation on a regulation, that recommendation would be forwarded to the board. And if the board decided to take official action, at that point, we would follow through with these steps listed on page 5 and 6. Also on page 6, it notes that policies may be adopted by a board to guide its internal operations, and also that a board may create guidance documents to describe how the board's current approach or interpretation of law or general statements of policy that describe how and when the board will exercise discretionary functions. And the guidance documents and notes should be posted to the board's website. And as I mentioned before, we do have a policy section of the board's website where these documents are posted. On page 6, there's some guidance to be an effective board member or an effective advisory committee member. One of the most important things is to read the board's statutes and the regulations. For members of this advisory committee, a good place to start would be to read through the statutes or regulations related to the master's level psychology profession itself. And that's why I spoke earlier about having forwarded those regulations on unprofessional conduct as a good place to start to become familiar with what is in the regulation. It's recommended to be alert for agency policies and internal procedures which are inconsistent with or conflict with the board statutes and regulations, or which affect requirements for applicants or licensees. So if you do note any issues and you notice those, please bring them up and bring it to our attention, and we can clarify why that is the way that it is. Or if there's things that need to be changed, we can go through the appropriate steps to change those. On page 7, it says to ensure that decisions are within the authority granted, be willing to initiate action to amend statutes or modify regulations, and remember the purpose of imposing discipline against licensees is to encourage compliance with the law and protect the public, and to always be mindful that the role of the board is to protect the public and not the licensee. On page 7, there's some additional information there about conflicts of interest. It notes that conflicts of interest typically mean having any interest, financial or otherwise, direct or indirect, or engaging in any business or transaction or professional activity, or incurring any obligation of any nature which is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the board members' duties in the public interest. Board members must make public and recuse themselves from any conflict of interest that exists to ensure the integrity of the board and all of its decisions. And then after that, it notes some different types of conflict of interest to be on alert for, including some personal conflicts such as personal gain or bias. And it also notes that it could be because of a personal relationship. And what we would ask and expect you to follow is that if you believe there may be a conflict of interest or a perception of conflict of interest, that would be a good opportunity to note that you will need to recuse yourself from a vote. And that's all that you really need to say. And if it's a borderline type decision, we would ask that you err on the side of caution in this area. Even if it means that a vote will have to be delayed to a future meeting, it is better to go ahead and do this and then have the vote be delayed than to look back afterwards and to regret not having done that in the first place. So please err on the side of caution if you believe there might be a conflict of interest in a certain area. On page 8, the next item to talk about is confidentiality. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but it says at all times the board member must conform to the rules of confidentiality in dealing outside of the boardroom. Protected information obtained in the capacity of a board member or advisory committee member must remain confidential during and after board membership. Termination of board membership does not dissolve the board member from responsibility. And I think an important thing to start on here with confidentiality is that most things we talk about and most things that we do are not going to be confidential, but it is important to be aware of some things that are confidential. We talked a little bit earlier about information in executive sessions. It is confidential. Now, those executive sessions will have to happen after we're in an open meeting. So there'll have to be a motion to go into an executive session. And then once we're in the executive session, the content of that executive session would be the confidential information. Generally, the reasons why you might go into an executive session would be consultation with the attorney for the board, personnel matters that have to go before the board, or potential litigation that might come before the board. Also, there are hearings that generally this will be a board activity, not an advisory committee meeting activity, but there are individuals who may be denied for licensure and then appeal that decision and request a hearing. After the hearing takes place, there are deliberations by board members with legal counsel. Those discussions that occur after the deliberation are in a closed session with the attorney for the board, and those are to be considered confidential. On page 9, there's a section that talks about ex parte communication that generally probably won't involve you as advisory committee members, and I won't talk about it in great detail, but the general principle is that in certain situations, for example, let's say a hearing where someone appeals a decision by the board, it's important that the person representing the board in that case and the person who is following the process for that hearing, it's important that they receive certain information at the same time and that the board receive information from both of them at the same time. And so we have certain processes to follow. So I won't go into a lot more detail on that, but it's basically about a general principle of fairness under certain processes. If you do have questions about that, feel free to reach out and let me know. At the bottom of page 9, in terms of professional activities, a board member or an advisory committee member may hold an office in a professional or trade association of the regulated profession, but may not lobby for or cast votes regarding a matter that would impact the professional association or the board member's office in that association. The board member may not use his or her position on the board to further the interest of the professional association or his or her office in that association. Board members may attend professional conferences and social events, but they must be mindful of open meeting rules and conflicts of interest. If a majority of board members are present, do not discuss the board or affairs of the board to avoid triggering a meeting under the Kansas Open Meeting Act. So the takeaway from that section is that it's okay to become members of associations which might have a different goal than the BSRB, but when you are serving in this capacity as advisory committee members, please always be aware that your responsibility here is to wear the hat of a board member or an advisory committee member. And remember that this is the public protection agency, and your votes should be motivated by that responsibility and that duties versus any other feelings that you might have in regards to your other memberships and other associations. On page 10, under other contact, note that you should not represent yourself as speaking for the board or speaking for the advisory committee. You will likely be asked questions because of your role as an advisory committee member or a board member about how the board feels on a certain topic or what the board would do in a certain situation. And it's okay to note that you are a board member or you are an advisory committee member, and it's okay to talk about actions the board has taken. Just make sure you don't represent your feelings as that of the board's feelings or advisory committee feelings. The board does delegate to me some of that authority when it asks me to present testimony on behalf of the legislature, but I do my best to limit myself to what the board has specifically talked about and the decision that they have made. On page 10, there's some information about the Kansas Open Meeting Act. Most meetings of the BSRB fall under the Kansas Open Meeting Act or the COMA. And under that act, it says that basic meetings should be open to the public because the representative government is dependent upon an informed electorate. The board meetings and advisory committee meetings in general do fall under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, which is part of the reason why we are broadcast this meeting on the YouTube channel for the agency. It does also talk about what constitutes a meeting under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, and that's really important for you to understand. A meeting is any gathering or assembly of persons, in person or through the use of telephone or other medium for interactive communication, by a majority of the members of the agency or public body subject to the act for the purpose of discussing the business or affairs of the public body or agency. And then it notes some examples of things that you may not think about normally as something being a meeting. So it could be that you are in the same room or on the same meeting. That would need to be open. We would need to provide notice. We would need to have the opportunity for individuals to attend or be able to view what's going on at the meeting. It talks about if you're in a social situation, you need to make sure that you're not having discussions about the work of the board or the advisory committee. Even if you're not there at an official meeting of the board, that can still constitute a meeting when it's the majority of members of the committee that are having somewhat of a discussion, and the content of the discussion relates to those responsibilities of board or advisory committees. Then it talks a little bit about our responsibility in terms of providing notice and what we're responsible for in terms of minutes and things like that. It also notes that the board does not have to follow a set process like Robert's Rules of Order, but if you do follow something, you have to make something documents available to the public, the agenda available to the public, and etc. On page 12, it talks about that if there's any issues with the Kansas Open Meeting Act, those are investigated by the Attorney General's office. It's a civil matter, not a criminal matter, and individuals would have to file complaints for there to be an issue with that. On page 13, there's some information there about the Kansas Open Records Act. So most documents that we provide to you, most documents we have here at the office are subject to the Kansas Open Records Act should we receive a proper request for records or a request under the KORA. There is certain information that would be confidential or private. For example, things like social security numbers, certain address information, etc. But it's important to know that a lot of the communications might be open to the Cora. So, and it's not just about things that are filed documents. It could be emails, it could be text messages. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that just be aware of the phrasings you use when you communicate back and forth with the board office, or, you know, if you're asking certain questions about certain things, because it could just be an email, but that email could appear in a hearing or could be made public at a later date or requested by a member of the public. So something as professionals, I'm sure you're aware of, but always a good idea to hear it and be reminded of that. Again, on page 15, it talks about the Cora as a civil act, not a criminal act. And there's some other information there about the Attorney General's responsibility to investigate if there's a complaint on the Cora. Under page 16, there's some information there about the CAPA, the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act. It basically notes that most of the meetings of the BSRB are public and open. However, there's certain times when we have meetings of the board that are not. They fall under the CAPA based on the statute of the board's say. Some of the examples of CAPA meetings would be in examination of the licensure applicant of a specific person. So information relating to a specific person and their licensure application would be under the CAPA. Additionally, the Complaint Review Committee, as they look at investigations and discipline against a particular practitioner, would fall under CAPA and would also not be open to the public. There's some additional information there about the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, but I think the only other note that I wanted to talk about today in the training is on page 21. And that's at the bottom of page 21. There's a note there I wanted to highlight for you. This is going to pertain mainly to board members, but I wanted to reference the Kansas Tort Claims Act. So the Kansas Tort Claims Act generally governs the liability of the state of Kansas and its agencies and employees. An employee includes a member of the board or committee of a governmental entity, including elected or appointed officials and persons acting on behalf or in service of the governmental entity in any official capacity, whether with or without compensation. The basic rule of the Tort Claims Act is vicarious liability for any actionable wrongful act or omission of the government employees within the scope and course of their employment, subject to the affirmative acts of immunity that may exist on a case-by-case basis. So if you are sued for an act that occurred within the scope of your duties as a board member, you are entitled to have the Attorney General's office defend you at no cost. As I mentioned, that really applies more to people who are employed by the agency. It does extend to board members, but it doesn't extend to advisory committee members, to my understanding. But it basically means that if you are sued because of an action that you did within the scope of your employment or scope of your duties with the BSRB, you may be able to have the Attorney General's office defend you at no cost. There's certain processes you have to follow that are on page 22. You have to request that representation within a certain period of time. It has to fall into certain categories, but that is something just to be aware of. Hopefully it will not come up, but it's important to reference. So with that, I'll go ahead and end the training. And I will just say that, you know, sometimes this is a lot of information, and sometimes at the end of training, individuals are a little unclear of who they can talk to after the meeting, and they don't want to violate the Open Meetings Act. The important thing is that, you know, you just need to avoid the majority of members of the committee. So should you have a question for the chair of the board, yes, the two of you can communicate back and forth. That's not a problem. It's always recommended when you're talking about BSRB matters, it's a good idea to include me on that as well. Any of you can always contact me as staff of the BSRB. We follow a different set of rules, but we can assist any of you. And if it's just a couple of you having a conversation outside of a meeting, that's fine. You just want to make sure it doesn't involve the majority of members, whether it's over email or whether it's in person. And you also want to watch for something called chain communication. So you may think, well, I just talked to one member of the committee, so that I'm fine. But if you talk to that one member and then that member forwarded it to another member and then that member forwarded it to another member, you could run into an issue there, because even though you didn't intend for it to involve the majority of the committee, it did. So it's good to be aware of that and limit your conversations to a really small group if you should talk to each other outside of a meeting related to BSRB business. But should you have any questions on gray areas or anything like that, or anything that's in this packet that maybe I didn't go into further detail, just let me know, reach out. I'm always happy to help and assist you with anything in relation to your responsibilities. But I should have said this at the very beginning. I am really excited to work with all of you. the work that you do as an advisory committee member and a board member is really important work. And I'm really excited to work with each of you on these topics. And I appreciate you volunteering your time to do this. So with that, I'll go ahead and end the training and see if there's any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? That was a great presentation in a very compressed amount of time, Dave. I'm impressed that you were able to get through all that.
Thanks, Dave.
I would also say the most common thing, my experience, that people are going to ask of you is when they're having trouble with their own license, or they know somebody who's having trouble with their license, or work with somebody. And if they find out that you're connected to Bsrb, they may come to you and say, hey, can you help with this? And so I think Dave's advice would always be direct them to him or to Leslie. It's fine to help be a conduit of that, but there's almost always reasons those issues are happening, and it's good to get yourself kind of out of the middle of that situation.
Yeah, it's very good advice. And one thing too is, we do have situations come up sometime where you might have someone who is seeking licensure, and then they're hired by a certain person, and the person who's the employer might want to reach out to our office on behalf of the person seeking licensure. Well, because they're not the applicant, we're really limited on what we can talk to the employee or employer about. But we are always happy to check and look to make sure that there's nothing that might have accidentally been holding up the process, or if there is something more complicated, we're always happy to follow up with those licensees and let them know. So yeah, if you do get any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me and Leslie, and we're happy to help out with that.
Let's see, next on our agenda, I want to try to get through this really, really quickly. Gave you a discussion on committee work for upcoming year. Was that mostly around reviewing specific parts of the regs?
Yeah, we were asking all the advisory committees as time allowed, and with the training, there usually hasn't been a whole lot of time for this part of the agenda, but just kind of wanted to open it up a little in case there were any items that specific advisory committee members wanted to make a priority for the advisory committee to discuss either at the next meeting or at some time this year. So this is the first meeting of the year. I thought it'd be a good time to open that up in case there's items to put on the schedule for later this year.
Could we discuss at some point, I know obviously there are certain things we don't make decisions on in here, but can we discuss at some point what it would look like to have master's level clinicians recognized to administer and sign off on assessments in the state of Kansas? Because with the shortages and some of the requirements by insurance, and again, I know it's in other entities, there are plenty of clinicians that have gone through substantial training for assessments and could provide that service. But, if you lack oversight via PhD, you can't, or let's say you have a PhD in the facility, but, they're very tied up so they can review parts of it, but they can't sit in on the full thing, like what that would look like, I guess, essentially.
That created a lot of really blank stares. I'm certainly going to have to refamiliarize myself with that part of what the regs are in the statute in regard to that, because it's.
Well,
but yes, if that's
was
part
gonna
of the
say-
regs or rules, we could certainly review that. Go ahead, Leslie.
Are you asking for reimbursement?
I think it's more recognition. So an example, so at Washburn, I went through a lot of training, but if I were to administer an assessment, it's not recognized by a number of insurances unless it's signed off by a PhD first, even though I went through the right training for it. So it's
Right.
what would that take? Not saying I don't need to be overseen by someone who's at doctoral level, but what would it take to not have that second signature if I've done the correct steps to do it, is what I'm looking for, is kind of what I'm thinking might be beneficial.
For the LMLPs or the LCPs?
More so the LMLPs. I know the LCP, well, I mean, it would, I think for both, but I do know the LCPs are
They're
it's
already
more
independent.
flexibility than they're able to. Yeah, so it's the LMLPs if they've gone through the right training.
Okay. Thank you.
And certainly if you come up with other areas, you can ask about those at any time. Our next meeting, we had tentatively looked at Thursday, April 14th, but I think according to Josh's email, he teaches class on Thursdays at this time. So what about the day before, Wednesday, the 13th? Would that work for people?
Of April, correct?
Yes.
That would work for me.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Lauren?
That is the day of the annual Kansas Mental Health Summit. And I am attending that, so I'll be unavailable that day. I
What
believe
about-
that summit is scheduled for the 13th and the 14th of April.
How about the 20th?
That would also work for me.
Yep, me as well.
I'm a probably.
What time are we looking at?
I think we've currently scheduled noon to 2, if that works.
I could make that work.
Iris? All right, so 4:20, noon to 2.
Now, Dave, you said that Josh had a class on, was it just that one Wednesday that he had the class, or?
I thought it was Tuesdays and Thursdays. I thought his email
Oh.
mentioned that Wednesdays, let me look at it. Yeah, Wednesday and Fridays are more flexible, he said.
Okay, so we're looking at Wednesday, April 20th from noon to 2.
Correct.
And I have to apologize. I was looking at March. March is when the mental health summit is. April, sorry to throw a wrench, everyone. April, I could look at, or we can stick with what we just decided.
April 13th?
April 13th. Well, now that is so strange. I'm going to blame COVID and user error on my part with my Outlook calendar. That does look like it's showing up in April. I'm sorry.
So
It-
13th
yes,
is still a problem?
the 13th is still a problem, but
Okay.
the 20th is perfect.
All right, we will go with that. Any other business? If not, I would happily welcome a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you all so much for your participation. Really, really great meeting today. And Lauren, hope you feel better, and everybody else stay safe.
Dave, you might want to just go ahead and take a quick vote on that adjournment motion, because you had a motion and a second, but not a vote. So
My mistake. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Both hands aye. Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
We'll
You
see you
welcome.
guys in a couple months.
Awesome.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Take care, everyone.
You too.